Union representing faculty and staff at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay demonstrated in Ashwaubenon today outside the office of Board of Regents member Dr. Ashok Rai.
UWGB United wants to call attention to university leadership, their concerns with wages and working conditions. Victoria Frazier was at that demonstration and has more on the group's next steps. Victoria.
Kimmy and Bill, UWGB United members say they will continue to reach out to chancellors and the university's Board of Regents to add a meet and confer policy to the board's agenda before their next meeting April 15th, allowing them to talk about what they consider to be issues on the campus.
Union members at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers, hope that the UW Board of Regents will pass a meet and confer policy by the end of summer to ensure chancellors will meet face-to-face with elected union leaders.
At a time we're facing so much uncertainty, it's really important that faculty and staff have the ability to talk to administration about these things, to share ideas.
UWGB United President John Shelton visited the office of Board of Regents member Dr. Ashok Rai Friday. He wanted to ask for his commitment in supporting the policy, which he says will improve faculty, staff, and campus operations. But Shelton was told Dr. Rai was out of the office.
We want to do right by students. We want to make sure our teaching conditions are our students' learning conditions, and we want to make sure that we have good staff here, good faculty here who aren't constantly looking for other jobs. We want to make sure when somebody does leave that the position is filled.
UWGB Associate Professor of Psychology and Union member Brian Welsh says they are looking for an explanation into some of the recent decisions made on campus, including budget cuts.
We've had to make some tough decisions about what gets funded and what gets cut, what continues. And there hasn't been much, if any, input or avenues for input from workers. That's both faculty and staff.
University of Wisconsin officials shared a statement with Action 2 News saying, quote, leadership at our universities and the Universities of Wisconsin administration meet regularly with shared governance groups to consult on a wide range of matters. These shared governance groups are authorized by state statute and regent policy as the official elected bodies to represent faculty and staff, end quote.
Again, the Board of Regents will meet on April 15th. We reached out to several Board of Regents members today, including Dr. Ra, for comment, and have not yet heard back. Reporting live in the newsroom, Victoria Frazier, Action 2 News.